Before I start talking about the confronting terror in the democratic society, a few words of introduction because I think it's important. Well, first of all, Benjamin already told you, I was born in the States. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. And then when I was 2.5 years old, I convinced my parents that it's time to move to Israel. And that's why we're here since. I grew up here in Jerusalem, and when I was 8 years old, the Six-Day War broke. And actually, if you know a little bit about the history of the Six-Day War, it was quite clear that Egypt was planning to start a war against Israel. And Egypt was a great country with a very strong army. Israel was a very small country. And we knew of this about 3 weeks before. And I can tell you as a child, I know my parents, everybody was very worried. What would happen? We weren't sure that we really hold a chance against the Egyptians, against the Egyptian army. And when the war broke out on the 5th of June, 1967, 8 o'clock in the morning, the Israeli Air Force attacked all the airports of the Egyptian Air Force. And actually most of the airplanes were bombed when they were still on the ground. And that actually changed the whole battle with Egypt. But that same morning, the president of Egypt, Nasser, called King Hussein, the king of Jordan, and tried to convince him to take part in this war. And Hussein didn't want, he was debating if to take part in this war. And Nasser told him, we're on the way to Tel Aviv. So this is your chance. And at 11 o'clock that same morning, exactly when I was walking back from school, on the way back home, they sent us home early because the war broke out. And just as I was walking home, the Jordanians started shelling Jerusalem. And as an 8-year-old child, I was running just between these bombs exploding on right and left. You see direct hits, houses burning. And I was running through these bombs and the smoke and the noise. That was my experience as an 8-year-old. That was my first war. Running back to my home. I didn't make it because someone stopped me on the way and threw me down into a shelter just a few houses before my house. And I waited there for a few hours until my mother came and picked me up. And that was part of my experience. And then the years coming were full of terror attacks. You know, in Israel, we always have terror, waves of terror. Each time they're different, but there's ups and downs, but there's always some kind of terror attacks. And that was true also after the Six-Day War. And in '69, my parents were sent to some kind of a mission in the United States. We were in New York for 4 months, and I went to public school. And we had to write an essay of 3 wishes. If we could ask, what would you ask? And when you come with this kind of a background, so you don't ask for a bicycle, a new bicycle, or a private room, or a new football. So I just asked 3 wishes. One was that there shall be no more wars in the world. The second one was that all the Israeli soldiers that were injured would recover. And since I'm a religious Jew, so I asked that the Messiah would come. Those were my 3 wishes. I'm not sure that my children today, that would be exactly their priorities. But that's what in 1969, a 10-year-old child was asking for. So I told you I grew up here in Jerusalem. I did my regular army service in the Golani infantry brigade. I served as an officer. I was a company commander, including during the Lebanon War of 1982. And when I finished my army service, I went into law school. I'm a graduate of the Hebrew U. And I worked for several years for the Attorney General's office here in Jerusalem. And I was asked, in 1992, I was asked to join the judicial military system for 1 year. They were missing military judges, and they asked me to take a year off from from the Attorney General's office and join them as a military judge. And I said, well, 1 year, that sounds reasonable, I can do that. I took 1 year off and I stayed for 14. And I served as the president, the Chief Justice of the Military Court in the Gaza Strip. And later on, I was Deputy Legal Advisor of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And during that time, I took part in the peace process, the negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. And I took part in drafting the interim agreement. And I said this was that child that was wishing that there shall be no wars. And here I was taking part in trying to draft a peace agreement. Unfortunately, the suicide attacks from the Hamas actually, I won't say put an end to this process, but they made it very, very difficult, of course. And we're stuck in this same situation since. Later on, I was appointed to the Chief Justice of the Military Court of Appeals. I was actually in charge of all of the military courts in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And my last job was, I was asked to join the police force, this time as the legal advisor of the Israeli National Police. And that's how I met Benjamin and Rosita, and that's why I'm standing here in front of you today. So, well, we're talking about confronting terror in a democratic society, and we're talking about the case of the lone attackers. I wrote 2015-16. It's not correct or not very accurate because some of these attacks are continuing till this day. Just this week, there was a case where a Palestinian in the old city of Jerusalem stabbed civilians. It's going on since, but I think those 2 years, 2015-16, first thing the number of terror attacks was enormous, and it was a wave because day after day, or sometimes several attacks on the same day, and this is something new. Terror was never new. We always knew that we had terror, but this was something different from many points of view. For example, when you're talking about regular, if there is something that's called regular terror attacks that are committed by terror organizations, then we have quite good information of what's going on in these organizations, and many of these terror attacks were actually people were arrested. Terrorists were arrested before committing these attacks. Because, as I said, we have quite good information what's going on inside these organizations. What's so unique and special with these lone attackers was that actually these attackers made their decisions without letting anybody else in knowing of what they were planning to do. So just a few words about a little bit of background. So today we're talking about in Israel more than 8.5 million people. By the way, that's Massachusetts. It's about the size, I think it's quite, it gives an idea of the size of Israel. And even the populations vary. The numbers are quite close, I think. 75% of the population are Jews, 21 are Muslims, and the rest are Christians or believers of other religions. The Israeli National Police is, I would say, it's different than what we know in the United States. We have only one national police, and we have what we call a dual-purpose police because we're not only dealing with regular crimes, trying to prevent crime, public order, but we're also responsible for the internal security. Okay, this is something quite unique. You might have seen when you went to East Jerusalem, to the west, to the old city yesterday, you might have seen not soldiers, but policemen wearing green uniforms. Okay, so that's part of the Israeli police, and they're actually dealing with internal security, trying to prevent terror, dealing with terror attacks. Altogether, we have 29,000 police officers in 7 police districts from north, central, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, south, and the West Bank. Altogether, 7 different police districts. A few words about Jerusalem, since we're here. And I think before we read the numbers, it's important to mention that yesterday was Jerusalem Day. And as you probably know, Jerusalem Day is a Israeli national holiday that commemorating the unification of Jerusalem and establishing the Israeli force in the Western Wall, in the old city of Jerusalem. And this was something that you probably know from the history. Jews were living here in Jerusalem. That's where David, the King David, was living here in Jerusalem, and his son Solomon. And actually, Jews were expelled from Israel. They were out of this country. Most of the Jews were out of this country for close to 2,000 years, scattered all over the world. But what remained was something very, very important, that Jews, as you probably know, pray from every place in the world that you are. You pray towards Jerusalem. And in our prayers, we always ask to come back to Jerusalem every year. We on the Passover meal, we ask next year to be in Jerusalem. And this was something that went on for 2,000 years, and that's probably what kept the Jewish people together and believing that one day this will happen. And it happened. It took time. Some will say we had to have the Holocaust in order that this should happen. But today it's a fact. We are here. And Jerusalem was reunified for the first time after 48, after the War of 48, the War of Independence. And Jerusalem is a big, big problem. If I'm talking from a police point of view, Jerusalem is very difficult, because being a policeman in Tel Aviv is like being a policeman in New York, for example. But to be a police officer in Jerusalem is something else completely, because you're dealing with the complexity of different variation of populations and problems that you don't have in any other place, I think, not only in Israel, maybe in the world. We have today more than 800,000 people living in Jerusalem, only 3,500 police officers, and it's the holy city for the three main religions. For the Jews, it's the Western Wall. It was once Temple Mount, but the Muslims built what we call Haram el-Sharif. It's not a mosque, by the way. There's a mosque on Temple Mount. Haram el-Sharif, what you see, that golden building there, it's not a mosque, but it's one of the sacred places for the Muslims, and of course the Church of the Sepulchre for the Christians. So all these religions have to live together in the same city. So this was just a little bit of a background, and now we're going into talking about these lone attackers and how we deal with this from a legal point of view. And before we do so, I want to show you a very short film, and I'm warning you in advance that some of the pictures are not easy to watch. You will see some cases of stabbing, of car ramming, and but I think after seeing this short film, I think it will be easier to talk, because we'll know what we're talking about. Okay, so I apologize in advance. Let's take a look. There's a car just running over civilians. This is in a supermarket, stabbing civilians in a supermarket. Another car ramming, just running into people. This is stabbing in Damascus Gate in the old city. And here a car running into a bus stop. And it's not over. The driver gets out of the vehicle with an axe in his hand, and he starts attacking civilians. There's a civilian guard just coming in with his pistol. He's shooting the terrorist. He stopped using his weapon, but look what happens now. The terrorist is getting up on his feet again. He shoots him, shoot him one more time until he subdued this attacker. So what's so special about these current events is, first of all, we said these lone assailants. Most of them, as Benjamin mentioned before, they themselves did not know that same morning that they will take part in a terror attack. They woke up and maybe they were incited through the social media, or perhaps one of their family members was killed by the IDF or by the police by the police if they were involved in terror. And that same morning they decided they're going to go and be involved in a terror attack. They go to their mother's kitchen, they take out a knife, and they go downtown. You don't need more than a knife, and they start stabbing people in a supermarket, or they take their car or their father's car and just run into people standing in a bus stop. And that was what was so unique and special about this terror wave. And when the person himself, the terrorist himself, does not know that same morning that he's going to be involved, how do you try to prevent such a terror attack? How do you know about this terror attack? So we try to go through the social media and see if there's something special, and we do that. But sometimes someone will write an hour before he goes out that he's planning a terror attack, so that makes it easier if you have an hour to find someone. But sometimes it's a matter of minutes, and the next thing that you know is someone running over with a car, running into a bus station. Quite a few minors. We had more than 20%, and say minors, I mean under the age of 18. We had close to 20% of these assailants, of these attackers were minors, and quite a few women. This is also something quite unique. And as I said, no explosives, not so many guns. It's usually stabbing with knives and car ramming. From time to time someone had a gun. But that's, as I said, in most cases it was knives and car ramming. And the main thing was incitement. Now, how do you incite people to get up in the morning and just take a knife and go and do something like that? Well, there were terror organizations that were trying to encourage these youngsters to go and to be involved in these terror attacks through the social media, trying to convince them that Israel is planning to overtake Temple Mount. Okay, Israel is planning to enter the mosque on Temple Mount. Things that, of course, were not true, but that's enough to make people make very difficult decisions, and it's a matter of minutes. He can, as I said, that same morning decide, well, this is enough, and. If someone has problems, for example, that he has problems with his family, for example, okay, or maybe he broke off from his girlfriend, for example, then he says, "I want to die." So what's the best way to die and die as a hero? Go and be involved in a terror attack. And the Hamas is very good in turning these people into great heroes. You'll see their pictures all over, and their families will get payments, and they'll take care of their families. So when we're talking about rules of engagement, we have here a small video clip that we train our police officers. Originally it's in Hebrew, but it was translated into English. So don't go home and tell your friends that the Israeli National Police is teaching the police in English. No, we teach them in Hebrew, but this was translated into English. So let's see a small part of this, if it works.
The characteristics of an active killing event. In an active killing event, the purpose of the assailant is to harm people indiscriminately, resulting in as many casualties as possible. Often, it is an attack that cannot be prevented based on intel. The MO can be stabbing, running over, shooting, cold weapons, and more. Several weapons can be used in various phases. For example, An incident that begins with or combines running over, exiting the vehicle, and attempting to kill with an axe, knife, or pistol. In an incident of this nature, the terrorist causes harm and takes no hostages. Reality in Israel is such that we are liable to find ourselves on scene at an active killing event. Generally, police officers will be summoned to the scene. However, at times, police officers may come upon the first circle, meaning the core of the incident, by accident, without any advance warning. As police officers, we have the privilege, responsibility, and the duty to protect human lives. And in that capacity, it is our duty to tackle and subdue the assailant and defuse the threat.
Okay, this could happen to any police officer, including the legal advisor of the Israeli police. This is a true story. One morning, when I was on my way to the police headquarters, which is not very far away from here, just when I got out of the neighborhood, I was hearing shooting, and people were screaming, and I just passed next to a bus station, and I asked people what happened, and they said there was a vehicle that just passed near the bus station. Palestinian opened fire. Luckily, nobody was killed or injured. And I asked him what kind of car was it. They said it was a white car, and it was a rush hour, and the street is full of cars, and there's nothing much you could do about it. And I tried to find this, try and identify the car, and I didn't succeed to do so. And it turned out that an hour later, these same attackers, these two Palestinians that were in the car, they went to another place, and when they tried to attack, to use their weapons once again, there were police officers in the area, and they shot them, and they were killed. So as I say, it can happen to any police officer. It's not that someone called 911 and told them there's a terror attack here in the neighborhood. It could be just on the way to work. It could happen to anyone. As I said, even to the legal advisor. So the rules of engagement, well, it's clear that not only police officer, every civilian, every human being has the right of self-defense, and when it comes to a police officer, it's very clear that not only you're entitled, you have the right to do so, but you have really the obligation and the responsibility to do so, because you're not only in charge of your own life, you're in charge of the security and the lives of all civilians. So this is quite clear, the fact that we can use our weapon. But here comes the big but. Our police officers are taught that they should use the minimum force required, and they should cease the use of force as soon as the threat, as the terrorist is subdued. And this is very clear, and we enforce these rules of engagement. And I can say it proudly, that our police officers, I can count on one hand the cases that we interrogated, because there were police officers, because we thought that maybe a police officer used his weapon when he actually did not need to use his weapon. And we have, by the way, a special department, not in the police. It's part of the Attorney General's office, and any complaint of this source will go to this special department, and they will look into this case, and if there's a need, they will bring this police officer to trial. But there were cases in the IDF where soldiers did use their weapons when it wasn't needed, and I can say proudly that we don't have even one case where a police officer used his weapon unlawfully. Maybe it's due to the fact that police officers are usually grown up, they have families of themselves. Our soldiers are usually 18, 19, and when you're talking about police officers, you're talking about people in their late 20s or their 30s, and so they're more responsible. And there were even cases where police officers, after a terrorist was arrested or was injured, and he was no longer a danger to other people, there were civilians that tried to attack this terrorist, and police officers were guarding and protecting this Palestinian terrorist that just a minute ago was trying to kill civilians, protect him and take him to the hospital to get him medical care. Okay, so this is very important, and this is something that I explained many times, that the rules of engagement in a war situation are different than the rules of engagement in what we call a law enforcement situation. I was a soldier. I was taught that in war, you use your weapon to kill, okay? Not to injure, not to arrest, not to subdue. Use your weapon to kill. That's what we were taught. That's what a war is about, if you like it or you don't. When you're talking about law enforcement, the rules of engagement are completely different. And although it looks like some kind of a war, it's not a war. It's a lot of terror attacks. It's a great threat, but it's not a war. And therefore, we insist that our police officers will use their weapon. They should not hesitate. We don't want a police officer to hesitate. They will use their weapon in order to subdue the attacker. But once he's injured, they won't continue using their weapon just to kill him. Okay? And another thing that is important today, when you have the media and I don't think there's one terror attack. You saw the pictures there, you saw the films. I don't think there's one terror attack that we don't have at least one film of what happened there. Many times it's from different angles, and you'll have several pictures of what happened there. And these things are released immediately to the social media, and everybody has an opinion. Everybody knows if the police officer or the soldier acted correctly. Was it lawful? Was it unlawful? Everybody knows. And I always recommend to whoever's willing to listen that we should wait, not to the court of the public opinion, but to the court of a court of law. And many times, things that you see at the first minute and you think that the police officer was acting unlawfully, turns out to be, because we don't see the full picture. So this is something that we learned through the years. A few words about criminal proceedings. I was asked many times, do you have special courts for terrorists? The answer is no. We have only one criminal code, and we have only one criminal system. We have one court system, and all people involved in criminal acts, it could be regular violations of the law, and it could be a terror attack, will be brought to the regular Israeli courts, dealing with the same substantive law, the same rules of evidence, and the same rules of procedure. Okay? So I was asked, when there's a terror attack, do you have to bring all the evidence to the court? Yes, you do. And does the terrorist have the right to have a lawyer? Yes, you do. And you can question all the witnesses, and the proceedings are the same proceedings. It's true in the Israeli court system. It's true in the military court system that I know very well. And we were dealing with very, very heavy terrorists. Some of them were sent to what we call life sentence, but some of them one of them was involved in sending 4 or 5 suicide bombers, and that was responsible for the death of 73 civilians. He was sentenced to 73 life imprisonment. Okay, you can ask me what meaning does it have? I mean, what's more than one life? But it's to show that he was responsible not for the death of one person, but for the death of 73 people, and he was brought in front of the military courts. But as I said, the rules of procedure and the rules of evidence are the same rules as in the regular criminal courts. And we do have a juvenile system. And many of these terrorists, as I said, were under the age of 18, and we have special rules. Some of them, if you're talking to someone under the age of 16, you cannot be sent to prison for a period longer than 6 months. And there's special rules dealing with these juveniles. There's some kind of criticism. Some people say, well, if you want to try and deal with a terrorist 16 years old, 15 years old, Sending him to 6 months of imprisonment is not very effective. What can you do? But on the other hand, I can tell you, and this is from my experience, when you send someone of this age into prison, you know that he's going to finish not only his BA, his MA, maybe his PhD in terror. He can enter 16 and he'll be leaving this prison when he'll be 20 or 20 something, and this time he'll be a real terrorist. So it's not always very clear that sending these youngsters to many years of imprisonment is the right answer. Is there a good way to deal with what we call ideological crimes? It's a very difficult question. We're not very good with succeeding to prevent regular criminals from going back into or committing crimes time after time. Many of these criminals, I think it's true in the States as well, people who served time will probably eventually, most of them or many of them, will go back to prison once again. And when you're talking about someone that's willing to kill himself, then what's sending him to 10 years or 15 years or 20 years of imprisonment? Will that really influence him or try to make him decide that he will not take part in any terror attacks in the future? So this is a very difficult question. Most of the reasoning of sending people to prison is actually getting them off the streets. If someone is serving a time of 20 years, well, you can be quite certain that during those 20 years he won't be involved in another terror attack. In most cases, we know of cases where people from the prison try to convince some of their family members to take part in terror attacks, but that would probably be the main reason of sending people to imprisonment. Administrative detention. This is something I don't know if many of you heard of. This is something, as a lawyer, I can tell you, as a judge, it's very difficult from a legal point of view, because you're actually putting someone into prison, not for something that he did, because we don't have evidence, or maybe you have the evidence, you can't bring them to court. Sometimes the evidence would be his best friend in the same terror organization, but you of course cannot bring him to court, because if you bring him to court, that will be the end of this witness. It will be the last time that he will be in court, or maybe he'll be at all. So, but we know that this certain terrorist is involved in terror attack. And why do we put him into administrative detention? Not to punish him for something that he did in the past, but to try to prevent him from doing something in the future. And to do so, you have to have evidence that he's planning to do something. It's not enough that he did something. You have to know that he's planning to do something, and you want to prevent another terror attack. And I'm asked time after time, well, if you have evidence, bring him to court. If you don't have evidence, release him. But if I'll tell you that this person, if we don't arrest him, will take part in a terror attack and 20 people will be killed, what would you decide in such a case? So there's a real dilemma in this from a legal point of view. But this is something that we know, according to international law, it's possible. You can send someone, according to international law, to administrative detention for a period not exceeding 6 months. You can renew it if it's still basis for holding him in administrative detention. You can renew it for another 6 months. According to international law, the detainee has the right to appeal to a court. In our system, he must be brought in front. Even if he doesn't appeal, he must be brought in front of a judge within 48 to 96 hours after he was detained. Of course, his family will be notified immediately when he was detained, and he can appoint a lawyer, any lawyer he wishes. He won't get the information the intelligence. He will not get this information, of course. The information will be brought in front of the judge, and the judge is the one who will have to make the decision if there was a ground for this administrative detention. And I can tell you as a judge, this is one of the most difficult jobs that I ever had to do, because when you're dealing with a regular criminal case, there's two sides. Every side has a lawyer. There's evidence. There's a examination, cross-examination, and you hear both sides, and you only have to make a decision. It's not always easy, but you make a decision after you hear both sides. Here, the detainee himself doesn't really know why he's held in detention. He may have a good hint. I mean, if he knows what he was involved in, he can, but he doesn't know. Do they know of A, B, and C, or perhaps they know only of A, or A and B? He doesn't know. He's not told. Because he gets a general topic. He's told, you are detained for 6 months because you are involved in terror and endangering the security of something very, very general. Nothing that he can really do something with. His lawyer will say, my client is innocent. He didn't do anything. And the prosecutor will say, well, here's a file. We advise the court to look into this information and see if there's really a base for this detention. And doing this, what we call judicial review, and I sat, I would say, probably more than 3,000 judicial reviews during these years that I was a judge and a chief judge. And you don't have any idea who this person is when you until you open the book, until you open the information that was transferred to you. And you see many times you see a very nice guy, he makes a very good impression, and he says, listen, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything. And then you say, okay, thank you, and you take all this information, and you sit and you go over it piece after piece, and you say, I can't believe it that this person, that he's involved in terror attacks. And as I said, the only reason that we do so is in order to prevent a future terror attack. And these administrative detention saved thousands of lives. Definitely, I can say it because I saw it in my own eyes. People that if they were not detained, they would take these terror attacks out, and probably many civilians were killed. In many of these judicial reviews, or in some of these judicial reviews, we decided that there may be certain base for this detention, but not enough. Usually we demand that there'll be more than one piece of information, because if you have only one piece of information, sometimes it could be that someone wants to cause some damage to someone that you think he's your friend, but he's not, and he'll go tell that you're planning a terror attack. Usually we ask for 2 or 3 or 4 pieces of information that show that this person really is planning to do something. Some of these are not only what we call human sources, but some of them are also technical. We have different kinds of means that we can base we can show that this information has a very good base. There were cases where I found no ground for this detention, and people were released that same day. An interesting story that I remember till this day, during one of the operations when the IDF actually entered the West Bank main cities and villages, because at that time the IDF tried to protect the border. They were on what we call the Green Line, and they were trying to prevent terrorists from entering Israel. But day after day, buses were exploding inside of Israel. And if you may heard of the Passover massacre in Netanya, when a suicide bomber entered a Passover meal and just pushed the button and exploded inside this hotel, and many people were killed, and that was actually the trigger that after that terror attack, Israel decided, well, we're entering the cities and will try to arrest the terrorists at their homes. And actually, most of IDF soldiers entered the West Bank, and in several days, thousands of Palestinians were arrested. They went with lists. They knew who they were looking for, and in several days, there were more than 3,000 Palestinians arrested. Well, there's no way that you can interrogate 3,000 people in a very short time, and so they did some kind of they went through the files, and they decided, I think, close to 1,500 were released after a few days. Some 300 they had good enough evidence, or they believed that they could find good evidence to bring them to regular criminal proceedings. But there were close to more than 1,000 Palestinians that they knew that they were involved in terror, but they didn't have enough evidence, and they wanted to bring them to administrative detention. Now, I can tell you, when I sit in a regular judicial review, you get a file this thick with 10, 15, 20 pieces of information, and you go through. When you have more than 1,000 people, and they have to, as I said, they have to bring it in front of a judge within 48 hours or maximum 96 hours. They cannot have a file like you were used to prepare and bring them to court. So they were debating what to do. We got to some kind of a deal with the Shabak, with the security authorities, and we said, you know what, bring us 1 or 2 pieces of information, bring the most serious pieces of information that you have, and that will be at least enough for the first several weeks. Then we'll see, we'll give you time, and then you'll prepare the file just the way you were used to do. So, and in one of these cases, they brought in 1 piece of information saying that this person, this terrorist, was putting together a bomb in his basement in his house, and this looked like a good enough base for sending someone for administrative detention for at least several weeks until they complete the file. He decided to appeal to the Court of Appeals, so it came in front of me, and when I got the file, I read it, and at the first minute I said, well, there's no reason, no ground for this appeal. Till this day, I don't know why. I said, something looks strange, I want to see the full file. In this case, I want them to bring the full file. I said, take 48 hours, not in all the 1,000 cases, just in this one case, bring me the full file of this person. And after 40 hours, they came with the full file, and was going over the file. And in one of the pages, I found that it said, one of the sources, one of the people that said that this was the terrorist, said that his name is such and such, but it's not this person, it's his cousin that has a very similar name. And because there was more than 1,000 detainees, they didn't have time to go over the file, they didn't see this piece of information. I was the first one to see it. That was my job as a judge, to go over the file and see. And of course, I released this person. I said, it's not him, it's his cousin. Released him immediately. And I made a decision that from that day on, all judicial reviews will take place only after they bring the full file. And they said, listen, it's impossible. We won't be able to do so. So I said, listen, I don't know. I was ordered by law to have this judicial review. I don't know how to do a judicial review if I don't have the full file. And it's your responsibility to find a way to complete these files. And they found a way. They took students that they trusted, that they had the right, that came from certain units that they trusted them, and they went over these files. They worked overnight, and they brought the full files, and that's actually the situation from that day on. This just comes to show the importance of judicial review, and it's as I said, it's the most difficult job of a judge, because you have to be not only the judge, you have to be the attorney for the terrorist, and you have to be the prosecutor, and the judge, all at the same time. And as I said, in most cases, there was a ground and there was a base for these administrative detention. As I said, they saved lives of thousands, probably thousands of people, of innocent people that could have been killed or injured. Do we like administrative detention? No, we dislike this method completely. Is there a better alternative? I don't think so. I don't think so. So what can we do? We can make sure that the judicial review is a real judicial review. We go over each piece of information and we're sure in 100% that we don't miss anything. That's the best we can do. And today, the numbers are much smaller. We don't have thousands of detainees. There were times where there were thousands of detainees. Today there's probably several hundred of detainees, usually 6 months, then sometimes it's for a year or year and a half, usually not longer than that. I can tell you of one more dilemma very shortly. We had a case of a suicide bomber who was on his way to blow himself up, and he was arrested. He was brought to, they couldn't bring the information because the information was coming from his friends of the same terror organization, and he was sent to detention for 6 months. That's the maximum that you can. When the time came after 5 months, well, the military commander that has the authority to order the continuation of this detention order, what do you think he'll decide after 5 months? Is this person still a danger for public security? Probably yes. We don't think that after 5 months he'll decide to go home and be a very good boy and sit home. He'll probably try and take part in a terror attack, and that's quite clear. The military commander will sign this order. It will go to the court, the judicial review. It might go to the Court of Appeals if there will be an appeal, and probably he'll be detained for another 6 months. What happens at the end of this year? No new information. The only piece of information we have is 2 or 3 sources that told us that this person was on his way to commit a suicide attack. What do you do after a year? Well, would you release him? Dilemma. Okay, the military commander says, I don't know, but I don't want to take a chance. So I'll sign the order. If the judge wants to release him, let the judge release him. Now it's the problem of the judge. The judge says, well, what will I decide? Will I take the responsibility? Will I release him? And if he blows himself up tomorrow, what will I do? Well, there's a Court of Appeals. If the Court of Appeals wants to release him, let the Court of Appeals do so. And he signs the order. Now it's in front of me, and I'm the last stop. I have to make the decision. What do you do after a year? What do you do after a year and a half? What do you do after 2 years? Eventually, someone has to make a decision, and sometimes it's playing with the lives of people. It's not a question if you'll be punished. We're not looking for punishment. We're looking for saving lives of innocent people. So these were some of the decisions that you had to make, and I know that some cases I said, well, no new information. We'll release this person after a year and a half or 2 years. He'll be released. And we were hoping that the Shabak will watch and look after these people, and if they have new information, they'll bring him once again to court. That's the only thing you can do, because administrative detention is not a life sentence. You can't keep someone in detention for life. You have to balance. Certain times you have to say, well, this is enough, and from now on, there's no legal base for holding someone in administrative detention. Demolition of houses. Now this is a real problematic one. And it starts actually it's not an Israeli law. This is part of the British Mandatory Emergency Regulations of 1945. When the British enacted these regulations, it was mostly against Arabs. It was what they call the Big Rebel of 36. When there were Arab Palestinian terrorists, and they decided to enact these regulations. Article 119 says something very simple. I'm sure you'll all understand it. It says that if a person involved in terror came from a certain place, the military commander has the right to demolish the houses of this person, his family, the whole street, the whole neighborhood, and the whole city. That's all. Very simple, right? Makes sense. Okay? That's Article 119. It's hard to believe. This was enacted in 1945. What happened in 1948 when Israel, after the War of Independence, Israel gets its independence? We don't have a legal system. We did what most cities, what most nations did in a similar situation. We took the law that was enforced at the time, and we said that this law will continue being enforced until we make a new law. Okay? So when Israel got its independence, we continued holding on to these emergency regulations of 1945 until there'll be a new law. Was there a new law? No, there wasn't. And these regulations are enforced actually till this day. Something interesting, the same thing happened in Jordan. Jordan got its independence in 1946. The mandate was in Jordan as well. Both sides of the Jordan River were part of Palestine at the time. And they did the same thing. They took these regulations and said, well, this is the law that we're enforcing. We'll continue enforcing it until there'll be a new law. In 1967, the Israeli forces entered the West Bank. According to international law, were demanded to continue enforcing the law that we find when we enter the territory. What's the law that we find there? These emergency regulations from 45 through the Jordanian legal system. That's why we have a situation where today, both in the West Bank and in Israel, we have this Article 119. And when you have such a powerful act, you use it. When do you use it? When there's really no other alternative. Because you believe, and we can talk about it, if it's really effective. Now, I'm sure that there's many effective ways. They're not all legal. That I can tell you as a lawyer, okay? In this case, it's a very, very rough and difficult issue, but from a legal point of view, this is the law. According to international law, this Article 119 is enforced in Israel, and it's enforced in Jordan, and therefore in the West Bank as well. But as lawyers, I can tell you we all feel very bad because we know that if someone did something wrong, it's quite clear that he should be punished. But there's no reason, usually, to punish his family, definitely not the whole street, not the whole neighborhood, not the whole city. Well, this part is very simple. Israel never demolished a whole street, a whole neighborhood, or a whole city. We were talking only about demolishing the house of the terrorist himself, okay, and his close family. Because if he lived together with his family, he's 18 years old, he lives with his parents and 5 brothers, okay, and he came from this house. According to Article 119, we had the military commander has the right to demolish the whole house. And I can tell you that it's a very problematic issue, but nevertheless it's very effective. We know of cases, quite a few, where parents brought their child to the police and said, my son was planning a terror attack, interrogate him, put him into prison, I don't want my house to be demolished. Okay? We know of cases where people that were involved in terror attacks said, I was asked to go and take part in a certain terror attack, I decided not to do so because I was afraid that this might cause the military commander to demolish my family's house. So we know it's effective. But nevertheless, it's a very problematic issue. Therefore, in 2005, when we talked about terror waves, well, 2005 was the end of the big terror wave of the suicide bombers that was around 2002, 2003. It started going down. 2004, 5, things were getting better. And there's a lot of criticism, both inside Israel and also international criticism against using this method of demolishing houses. So the government of Israel decided that although from a legal point of view you can use this Article 119, we will refrain from doing so as long as the situation remains as it is today. Okay? And this lasted for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015. 2015, we started once again this new wave of the lone attackers. And in order to try and stop, because what happens with these waves is people start imitating. Someone did something, I can do so myself. And then someone in the next neighborhood, and someone in the next city, and somewhere else heard of, and I also want to do something of that sort. And in no time, you see yourself in really things going up. So you have to do something very dramatic in order to try and stop this wave. So Israel government decided in 2015 to announce officially that we're going to use once again the power of Article 119, and we will demolish houses. A lot of criticism, yes. Effective, apparently yes. It was used only in cases where terror attacks ended with killing of people, in most cases. It's not enough that someone was injured. If someone was just injured in a terror attack, they will probably not demolish his house, the house of the terrorist. But if someone was killed, and definitely if there were several people that were killed in a terror attack, they will use it. Altogether, I think since the beginning of this wave, I think there were about 20 houses that were demolished. When I ask people, when they say it's terrible now, I ask them, how many houses do you think were demolished? And so hundreds, thousands, 20 houses, okay? It doesn't turn it into a less problematic question, but it puts it into a certain proportion. I think we know what we're talking about, okay? So I'll just show you something that someone wrote about the problematic of demolishing houses. You can read it for yourself. And I think if we agree or do not agree with it, I think we cannot ignore what he says. And if we know to say that by doing so, we will prevent other terrorists from taking part in a terror attack, and by doing so, we'll save lives of people, so at least we know that there's a certain base, a certain ground to do so. Okay, so that was a short brief, and I'll be glad to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm Isaiah Sampson from. Sorry, I need some space. I'm Isaiah Sampson from United States Air Force Academy. I was curious, do you guys have capital punishment? And then if so, like for instance, the guy who's responsible for like 72 deaths or something like that, why would that not be like a moment for capital punishment?
Okay. In Israel, you have capital punishment only for people that were involved in the crimes against the Jewish people during the Holocaust. Okay, and that's why Eichmann, for example, got the capital punishment. In regular courts, in the Israeli courts, there's no capital punishment. In the military courts, according to the law, there is. But in order to do so, the prosecutor must ask for this punishment. The judge will not give a punishment that the prosecutor did not ask for. And the prosecutor gets his orders from the government, and the policy in Israel is not to ask for capital punishment. It's a question that people talk about it all the time. Is it right? Is it wrong? Should we ask, or maybe we should not? I myself think it's wrong. I think capital, in regular crimes as well, I'm against capital punishment. We know of cases where after you punish someone, suddenly there's new evidence, and there's usually nothing you can do after someone was killed. And I don't think it's our responsibility to take lives of people. To punish, yes, definitely. Even if it's 74 life sentences, but not capital punishment. I say, but this is the matter for the government to make its policy. And if they decide to do so, so at least in the military courts, they're entitled to do so. Okay. Yes, please. Yes, sir.
Sir, Cadet Smith from the United States Military Academy. I was wondering, when you say demolish, or when you used it in this brief, did you mean that like the families were just taken and like made homeless, or was like the house like destroyed completely? Like, can you explain that?
Yes. Thank you for the question. I asked him to ask this question before. I missed this part. Originally, they would blow up the house. Why to blow up the house? Because that makes a big impact, right? Everybody hears, everybody knows. And if you really want to try and make people think twice before they take part in a terror attack, so this is a good way to do so. But in the last, I would say, 20 years, when there's a family member that was involved in terror and he lives in a certain part of the house that you can just try and demolish that section and leave the rest of the house, we will do so. And there were cases where one of the members of the family, the terrorist, for example, lived in the second floor. Now you cannot, it's a three-story building. You cannot just explode, blow up the second floor and leave the two other floors. It's a little problematic. So therefore what they would do in some of these cases, they would seal off the second floor and let the family live downstairs and upstairs, but they sealed off there's cases where they pour cement if it's the first floor, they'll pour cement into the first floor in a way that nobody can use the apartment on the first floor, but people that lived, if it was a different family, for example, that lived on the second or third floor, you won't blow up the whole house. So they'll be able to continue using. We try to minimize the effect only to the terrorist himself or to his very near close family, okay? Definitely not to neighbors that have nothing to do with the terror attack, or in many of the cases, not to another brother that is married and has children and lives, because many of the Palestinian families live together in the same building. So if there's a brother that wasn't involved in the terror attack and he's married and he has children, so usually we'll try not to affect this apartment and only the apartment where the terrorist himself lived in. Okay? Yes, sir.
Cadet Mara from the Virginia Military Institute. I was just curious, in providing terrorists with due process, are you always required to give up information in those files that could possibly contain intelligence, like sensitive intelligence?
No, as I said before, the only one that will see the full file is the judge. The attorney for the terrorists will not see this information. That's why I said that the judge is actually doing all parts, because the attorney can only get up and say, my client is innocent, he didn't do anything, but he really doesn't know what he's talking about. The only one that will see the full file is the judge. That's what makes it so complicated, and so the responsibility on the burden on the shoulders of the judge are, you don't sleep at night. Yes.
I'm Cadet Lopez from the Military Institute. What's like the political climate with Article 119, whether it be the ultra-Orthodox, secular, or the Arabs? Is there a different feel on the article based on political party?
Based on?
Based on like the political party / social aspect of it?
Well, of course, if there'll be a serious discussion, then of course there's people, the left part will say it's illegal, let's get rid of it. Who needs this 119? And because it really brings quite a lot of international criticism, and I can understand it. But I think the method that the Israeli government, the strategy that they took, I think it was right. We said it's legal because from a legal point of view, as I told you, it's part of, according to international law, it exists, it's part of the law in Israel. We should use it only in times when there's really terror waves that are you really need to try and stop this terror wave, okay? And if we can leave it, not use it like we did between 2005 and 2015, then let's put it aside. Let's not get rid of it completely, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Living here in the Middle East, living in Israel, when you're surrounded by enemies, you don't know what will happen tomorrow. So if you have a good method, let's keep it, but let's use it in a proportionate manner, only in times and only as much as you really need it. I think that's the right way to do it. I'll take your question, but there's someone here that was asking. Yes.
Sir, Cadet Monty Potter from point. It sounds like your main method of attacking the lone wolf terrorism is through the 6-month detention program. I'm curious, when you detain these lone wolf terrorists, are there programs in place inside the institution where they're put to help them try to rid their mind of terrorism, or are they just left on their own to figure out themselves?
They're usually left on their own, and it's an interesting question because, as I was saying before, when you're talking about terror crimes, the chances of trying to work with people and try to convince them that terror is wrong and it's not the right way and you should look for different ways, maybe take part in the peace talks like I did, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And there was one case, in regular criminal cases, yes, you can send people to different programs and try to hope that they will not return to crime. When you're talking about military courts, we don't have a system of sending people to different institutions. I did it in one case, and it's an interesting case, with no legal base, by the way. But to this day, I'm proud of this decision. There was a 15-year-old child. He was the youngest of 15 brothers and sisters. His father was very old, could take no responsibility for what his child was doing. He lived in a refugee camp out of Jericho, and he found a big brother, which happened to be a member of Hamas. Okay? And this older brother, he was 26, adopted this 15-year-old child, and as a big brother, he taught him how to use an M16 and how to throw a hand grenade, and started sending him with a pistol every day from Jericho to Bethlehem. When he got to the checkpoints, everybody saw a child 15 years old wearing a bag coming back from school. Nobody stopped him to open and see what he has inside. Each day he would take a pistol from Jericho to Bethlehem, and one day he took him with him. He said, "You want to take part in a terror attack?" He said, "Yes." He took him to a road near Jericho, and he said, "We'll wait for an Israeli vehicle to pass, and then we'll open fire." They were both holding M16s, and they shot. Luckily, nobody was killed or injured. And the next thing that he asked this 15-year-old child to do was to enter an Israeli settlement. He gave him a hand grenade, and he said, "You should enter this settlement and look for a crowded area and take out your hand grenade and throw the hand grenade." Luckily, when he got to the settlement, he was asked to open his bag. They found the hand grenade. He was arrested. What do you do with such a 15-year-old child? Do you treat him as a regular terrorist? Well, on one side, yes. He took a hand grenade. He was planning to throw this hand grenade against civilians, kill civilians. He's a regular terrorist. When you know the true story, how this child was neglected, wasn't taken care of by his parents, how this older brother influenced him, convinced him, you know that this is not a regular case. And the question was, is there really something that we can do? This was a case where I thought that if there was some kind of an institute that can try and do something with this child, maybe there's a chance, I don't know, maybe there's a chance that in the future he won't continue in this way, in this path. And I asked the attorney that was representing this child if there is such an institute in Ramallah. He said he'll check, and he came back with the name of an institute. They were willing, this institute gave me in writing, that they were willing to keep him in this institute for a year, not to let him go out, not to see his family. His family can come visit him in this institute, but they won't let him out for a year. And I decided to accept this, although there was no legal base for this decision. And I said, it can't be worse than sending him to prison. Because when he goes into prison, we know definitely that he will be influenced by others, and the chances are that the minute he'll be released, he'll go back to terror. If there is any chance, and I'm not sure, I'm very, very curious to know what happened. I don't know till this day. Was it effective? What happened with this child? But he was in this institute for a year. They ensured me that that's what's going to happen. I hope they really did, and I hope he decided not to continue. So this is really one case, but generally there's no institutions or ways to deal with these. And And it happens many times that people during their time in the prison, they get together with other members of terror organizations and they continue this working together after they're released. And we see them coming back either through regular prison or administrative detention. We see them going back time and again. Yes, sir.
Evening, sir. I'm Nicholas DeSimone from West Point as well. My question revolves around kind of police presence on the streets, and in your professional experience, how have you seen kind of striking that balance between increased police presence, which will do kind of preventative measures as well as reacting quicker, while also balancing that with increased police presence kind of giving them a more target-rich environment for those who kind of are incited to commit acts of violence against the police, and how you found to kind of strike a balance between those two, if such a balance exists?
Well, first of all, as you probably know, they don't attack police officers, or not only police officers, they attack civilians, okay? And we have a different system than what you have in the States, where almost everybody can go into a supermarket and buy a gun, right? That's practically the way. In Israel, you have to get a permit, and only usually it's people that served in the IDF will get a permit only if they have a special cause. If you live in a special area, for example, the West Bank, or you're working with diamonds or carrying a lot of money or something like that, you will probably get a permit, okay? But a regular person will not get a permit. In many of the cases, I would say in about 50% of the terror attacks, civilians were the ones that subdued these attackers, okay? It happened to be that someone was there. There was a case where JBC, a tractor, just started with the pail, started running into a crowd, into a bus station, and there was a civilian that just took out his pistol and shot the driver, and saved lives of many people that were standing in the bus station. So yes, in times of terror waves, we send as many policemen as we have. We don't have many. I told you in the whole district of Jerusalem, we have only 3,500, and that includes, of course, legal advisors, not only regular police officers, and we send everybody out to the streets in order to try and first to give the public a feeling of security. There's a lot of police officers on the streets and a lot of police vehicles, and but you can do it for a week, you can do it for 10 days, you can't do it for months. People have their jobs, they have to go back to their regular jobs, and but definitely when there's times of terror waves, we send as many policemen as we can. Finish with a short, it's a joke, it's not a true story, because people asked me in the past if it's true. No, it's not true. Brezhnev, Carter, and Prime Minister Menachem Begin met God, okay? And each one could ask one question. And Brezhnev goes up to God and says, will there ever be an end to communism? And God says, yes, my son, there will, but it's not going to be during your administration. And then President Carter walks up to God and says, my Lord, will there ever be an end to the Cold War? And God said, yes, President Carter, there will, but it's not going to be during your administration. And then Menachem Begin walks up and says, my Lord, will there ever be an end to the Israeli-Arab conflict? And after a few seconds of silence, God says, well, perhaps, my son, but it's not going to be during my administration. Okay, so it's a joke. So I can tell you, listen, we're living in a very special area, and I experienced the war when I was 8 years old, and I experienced terror attacks, and I took part in the peace talks, and I took part in drafting the interim agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and we were believing that that's history in the making, and that is only the first stage towards true and full peace, and it doesn't happen. Things in the Middle East take time. You have to have patience. So I don't know if it's going to be during my administration, but I hope that at least it will be during your administration. So thank you very much.